Settle in now, dear listener, and let your breathing slow to match the gentle rhythm of this ancient tale. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow yourself to drift backward through time. Past the bustling noise of the modern world, past centuries of change and progress, until you find yourself in a place where gods walked among mortals and the line between dream and reality was as thin as morning mist over a quiet vineyard. Tonight, we journey to ancient Greece, but not to witness grand battles or heroic quests. Instead, we find ourselves drawn to a much gentler story, one that unfolds beneath the dappled shade of grapevines, heavy with fruit, where the air is sweet with the scent of ripening berries and the soft buzz of contented bees. This is a tale of Dionysus, the god of wine and celebration, and his peculiar attempt to create something that had never existed before the very first vineyard picnic. Picture, if you will, the rolling hills of ancient Attica, or olive groves. Silver and the Mediterranean breeze and cypress trees stand like dark sentinels against a sky the color of worn marble. The sun here moves differently than in our modern world, casting longer shadows, lingering more lovingly on the faces of those who pause to appreciate its warmth. Time itself seems to flow like honey from a broken comb, sweet and unhurried, pooling in moments of perfect stillness. It is in this dreamy landscape that our story begins. Though begins is perhaps too definite a word for a tale that seems to have always existed, woven into the very fabric of the vines that climb the terraced hillsides. Dionysus, you see, was never quite like the other gods who dwelt upon Mount Olympus. While Zeus hurled thunderbolts and Athena pondered wisdom, while Apollo drove his chariot of sun across the sky and Artemis hunted in silver moonlight, Dionysus wandered the earth with a different sort of purpose entirely. He was the god of wine, yes, but also of something more elusive, the spirit of celebration itself. The mysterious alchemy that transforms a simple gathering into something magical. Where other deities concern themselves with grand matters of war and wisdom, justice and craft, Dionysus found himself drawn to the smaller, more intimate mysteries of human joy. He understood, in ways that his more serious relatives did not, that happiness was not merely the absence of sorrow, but an art form unto itself, requiring careful cultivation like the very grapes from which his beloved wine was made. Tonight's tale finds its roots in a moment of divine restlessness that came upon Dionysus during one of his earthly wanderings. He had been traveling, as was his custom, accompanied by his usual entourage of satyrs and maenads, those wild followers who danced attendance upon him with bells on their ankles and flowers in their hair. They had visited countless villages, blessed numerous vineyards, and presided over festivals without number. Yet something nagged at the god's consciousness like a stone in a sandal. The wine was flowing freely wherever they went. Certainly, grapes were ripening beautifully under his divine attention. The festivals were as joyous as ever, filled with music and laughter, and the kind of abandon that only comes when mortals temporarily forget their everyday worries. Yet Dionysus found himself wondering if there might be something more, some new way to weave together the threads of pleasure and companionship that he had not yet discovered. It was during a particularly quiet evening, as he reclined beneath an ancient oak tree whose branches had sheltered picnickers for countless generations, that the idea first whispered itself into his divine consciousness. The concept was so simple, so obvious, that he wondered why it had never occurred to him before. What if, instead of holding celebrations in temples or town squares, they were to take the entire experience outdoors, spread it like a feast across the very vineyards that produced the wine they loved so much? The notion was revolutionary in its simplicity. Picture it. Rather than gathering within walls, however beautiful, people would spread blankets directly among the vines. Instead of formal ceremonies with prescribed rituals, there would be an easy-flowing celebration that moved with the natural rhythms of the day. Food and wine would not be served from distant kitchens, but enjoyed right there among the growing grapes, creating a perfect circle of cultivation, creation, and consumption. Dionysus found himself enchanted by the possibilities. He imagined mortals, and immortals alike, reclining on soft blankets of woven grass and ivy, sharing bread and cheese and olives while the very vines that produced their wine rustled overhead. Children would play between the rows of grapes, their laughter mixing with the songs of birds and the distant bleating of goats on hillsides painted purple with wild lavender. The more he considered this vision, the more excited Dionysus became. This would not be simply another festival, but something entirely new, a celebration that brought together all the elements he loved most about mortal existence. The simple pleasure of food shared in good company, the joy of wine drunk under open sky, the music that rises naturally when hearts are light and cares are few. It would be, he decided, the perfect expression of everything his divine nature represented. Of course, being a god of impulse and inspiration rather than careful planning, Dionysus did not pause to consider the practical challenges his vision might present. He did not worry about weather or logistics, about the proper proportion of guests to available space, or about the countless small details that can transform a beautiful idea into a beautiful disaster. In his divine enthusiasm, he saw only the golden potential of his concept, the way it shimmered in his imagination like sunlight on water, as the oak tree's shadow lengthened around him and the first stars began to appear in the deepening sky. Dionysus smiled to himself with the satisfaction of a god who has just invented something wonderful. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin gathering his companions for this grand experiment. They would find the perfect vineyard, prepare the perfect feast, and create something that would bring joy to mortals for generations to come. Little did he know, as he drifted off to sleep beneath that ancient oak with its leaves whispering stories of countless other dreamers who had sheltered beneath its branches, that his perfect vision would encounter the charming imperfections that make any gathering of enthusiastic celebrants into something wonderfully unpredictable. But that realization lay waiting for him in the adventures ahead. As surely as the morning sun that would soon paint the eastern hills with shades of rose and gold, for now, there was only the gentle night, the soft rustling of leaves, and the contented sigh of a god who believed he had just solved one of life's most pleasant problems. The story of the world's first vineyard picnic was about to begin. Like all the best stories, it would unfold in ways that no one, not even a god, could entirely foresee. Morning came to the ancient world with the same gentle insistence it has always shown, painting the sky in watercolor washes of pink and amber, while dew settled like scattered diamonds across vine leaves and grass. In this soft light, as birds began their daily chorus, and the air filled with the green scent of growing things, we find ourselves better able to understand the realm over which Dionysus held sway, a kingdom, not of palaces and boundaries, but of moments and moods, of celebrations that bloomed like flowers and faded like music on the evening breeze. Unlike his fellow Olympians, ruled over clearly defined domains with the authority of absolute monarchs, Dionysus presided over territories that existed more in the heart than on any map. His vineyards stretched across the Mediterranean world, certainly, from the sun-baked hills of Greece to the gentle slopes of distant lands where Greek colonists had carried their love of wine like a sacred flame. But his true kingdom was wherever mortals gathered to celebrate the simple fact of being alive. Wherever wine loosened tongues and laughter echoed under starlit skies, picture him now as the sun climbs higher, as this most unconventional of gods, rising from his bed of soft moss and fallen oak leaves. Unlike Zeus with his magnificent beard and thunderous presence, or Apollo with his golden perfection and measured grace, Dionysus appears almost mortal at first glance. His hair falls in dark curls touched with premature silver, not from age 4. Gods do not age as mortals do, but from the wisdom that comes from walking too long among humans and understanding too well their capacity for both joy and sorrow. His clothing, when he bothers with it at all, tends toward flowing robes that seem to shift color with his mood, now purple as new wine, now green as young vine leaves, now gold as autumn grapes heavy with sweetness. Around his brow sits a crown not of precious metals, but of fresh ivy and grapevines, living ornaments that speak to his preference for the natural over the artificial, the growing over the made. But it is his eyes that truly reveal his divine nature, dark as wine dregs, yet sparkling with an irrepressible mischief that suggests he finds the entire cosmic drama of existence secretly amusing. These are eyes that have seen mortals do foolish things in the name of celebration. Eyes that have witnessed the birth of music from pure spontaneous joy. Eyes that understand that sometimes the most profound truths emerge not from solemn philosophy, but from the simple act of friends sharing a cup of wine as the sun sets behind purple hills. Settle in now, dear listener, and let your breathing slow to match the gentle rhythm of this ancient tale. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow yourself to drift backward through time. Past the bustling noise of the modern world, past centuries of change and progress, until you find yourself in a place where gods walked among mortals and the line between dream and reality was as thin as morning mist over a quiet vineyard. Tonight, we journey to ancient Greece, but not to witness grand battles or heroic quests. Instead, we find ourselves drawn to a much gentler story, one that unfolds beneath the dappled shade of grapevines, heavy with fruit, where the air is sweet with the scent of ripening berries and the soft buzz of contented bees. This is a tale of Dionysus, the god of wine and celebration, and his peculiar attempt to create something that had never existed before the very first vineyard picnic. Picture, if you will, the rolling hills of ancient Attica, or olive groves. Silver in the Mediterranean breeze and cypress trees stand like dark sentinels against a sky the color of worn marble. The sun here moves differently than in our modern world, casting longer shadows, lingering more lovingly on the faces of those who pause to appreciate its warmth. The time itself seems to flow like honey from a broken comb, sweet and unhurried, pooling in moments of perfect stillness. It is in this dreamy landscape that our story begins. Though begins is perhaps too definite a word for a tale that seems to have always existed, woven into the very fabric of the vines that climb the terraced hillsides. Dionysus, you see, was never quite like the other gods who dwelt upon Mount Olympus. While Zeus hurled thunderbolts and Athena pondered wisdom, while Apollo drove his chariot of sun across the sky and Artemis hunted in silver moonlight, Dionysus wandered the earth with a different sort of purpose entirely. He was the god of wine, yes, but also of something more elusive, the spirit of celebration itself. The mysterious alchemy that transforms a simple gathering into something magical. Where other deities concern themselves with grand matters of war and wisdom, justice and craft, Dionysus found himself drawn to the smaller, more intimate mysteries of human joy. He understood, in ways that his more serious relatives did not, that happiness was not merely the absence of sorrow, but an art form unto itself, requiring careful cultivation like the very grapes from which his beloved wine was made. Tonight's tale finds its roots in a moment of divine restlessness that came upon Dionysus during one of his earthly wanderings. He had been traveling, as was his custom, accompanied by his usual entourage of satyrs and maenads, those wild followers who danced attendance upon him with bells on their ankles and flowers in their hair. They had visited countless villages, blessed numerous vineyards, and presided over festivals without number. Yet something nagged at the god's consciousness like a stone in a sandal. The wine was flowing freely wherever they went. Certainly, grapes were ripening beautifully under his divine attention. The festivals were as joyous as ever, filled with music and laughter, and the kind of abandon that only comes when mortals temporarily forget their everyday worries. Yet Dionysus found himself wondering if there might be something more, some new way to weave together the threads of pleasure and companionship that he had not yet discovered. It was during a particularly quiet evening, as he reclined beneath an ancient oak tree whose branches had sheltered picnickers for countless generations, that the idea first whispered itself into his divine consciousness. The concept was so simple, so obvious, that he wondered why it had never occurred to him before. What if, instead of holding celebrations in temples or town squares, they were to take the entire experience outdoors, spread it like a feast across the very vineyards that produced the wine they loved so much? The notion was revolutionary in its simplicity. Picture it. Rather than gathering within walls, however beautiful, people would spread blankets directly among the vines. Instead of formal ceremonies with prescribed rituals, there would be an easy-flowing celebration that moved with the natural rhythms of the day. Food and wine would not be served from distant kitchens, but enjoyed right there among the growing grapes, creating a perfect circle of cultivation, creation, and consumption. Dionysus found himself enchanted by the possibilities. He imagined mortals and immortals alike reclining on soft blankets of woven grass and ivy, sharing bread and cheese and olives while the very vines that produced their wine rustled overhead. Children would play between the rows of grapes, their laughter mixing with the songs of birds and the distant bleating of goats on hillsides painted purple with wild lavender. The more he considered this vision, the more excited Dionysus became. This would not be simply another festival, but something entirely new, a celebration that brought together all the elements he loved most about mortal existence. The simple pleasure of food shared in good company, the joy of wine drunk under open sky, the music that rises naturally when hearts are light and cares are few. It would be, he decided, the perfect expression of everything his divine nature represented. Of course, being a god of impulse and inspiration rather than careful planning, Dionysus did not pause to consider the practical challenges his vision might present. He did not worry about weather or logistics, about the proper proportion of guests to available space, or about the countless small details that can transform a beautiful idea into a beautiful disaster. In his divine enthusiasm, he saw only the golden potential of his concept, the way it shimmered in his imagination like sunlight on water, as the oak tree's shadow lengthened around him and the first stars began to appear in the deepening sky. Dionysus smiled to himself with the satisfaction of a god who has just invented something wonderful. Tomorrow, he decided, he would begin gathering his companions for this grand experiment. They would find the perfect vineyard, prepare the perfect feast, and create something that would bring joy to mortals for generations to come. Little did he know, as he drifted off to sleep beneath that ancient oak with its leaves whispering stories of countless other dreamers who had sheltered beneath its branches, that his perfect vision would encounter the charming imperfections that make any gathering of enthusiastic celebrants into something wonderfully unpredictable. But that realization lay waiting for him in the adventures ahead. As surely as the morning sun, that would soon paint the eastern hills with shades of rose and gold. For now, there was only the gentle night, the soft rustling of leaves, and the contented sigh of a god who believed he had just solved one of life's most pleasant problems. The story of the world's first vineyard picnic was about to begin. Like all the best stories, it would unfold in ways that no one, not even a god, could entirely foresee. Morning came to the ancient world with the same gentle insistence it has always shown, painting the sky in watercolor washes of pink and amber, while dew settled like scattered diamonds across vine leaves and grass. In this soft light, as birds began their daily chorus, and the air filled with the green scent of growing things, we find ourselves better able to understand the realm over which Dionysus held sway, a kingdom, not of palaces and boundaries, but of moments and moods, of celebrations that bloomed like flowers and faded like music on the evening breeze. Unlike his fellow Olympians, ruled over clearly defined domains with the authority of absolute monarchs, Dionysus presided over territories that existed more in the heart than on any map. His vineyards stretched across the Mediterranean world, certainly, from the sun-baked hills of Greece to the gentle slopes of distant lands where Greek colonists had carried their love of wine like a sacred flame. But his true kingdom was wherever mortals gathered to celebrate the simple fact of being alive. Wherever wine loosened tongues and laughter echoed under starlit skies, picture him now as the sun climbs higher, as this most unconventional of gods, rising from his bed of soft moss and fallen oak leaves. Unlike Zeus with his magnificent beard and thunderous presence, or Apollo with his golden perfection and measured grace, Dionysus appears almost mortal at first glance. His hair falls in dark curls touched with premature silver, not from age 4. Gods do not age as mortals do, but from the wisdom that comes from walking too long among humans and understanding too well their capacity for both joy and sorrow. His clothing, when he bothers with it at all, tends toward flowing robes that seem to shift color with his mood, now purple as new wine, now green as young vine leaves, now gold as autumn grapes heavy with sweetness. Around his brow sits a crown not of precious metals, but of fresh ivy and grapevines, living ornaments that speak to his preference for the natural over the artificial, the growing over the made. But it is his eyes that truly reveal his divine nature, dark as wine dregs, yet sparkling with an irrepressible mischief that suggest he finds the entire cosmic drama of existence secretly amusing. These are eyes that have seen mortals do foolish things in the name of celebration. Eyes that have witnessed the birth of music from pure spontaneous joy. Eyes that understand that sometimes the most profound truths emerge not from solemn philosophy, but from the simple act of friends sharing a cup of wine as the sun sets behind purple hills. Dionysus stretches now in the morning light, feeling the familiar stirring of divine energy that calls him to movement, to wandering to the endless search for new ways to bring celebration into the world. This restlessness is as much a part of his nature as the ability to transform water into wine or to make grapevines bloom out of season. He cannot remain still for long, cannot be content with the marble halls and formal ceremonies that satisfy his relatives on Olympus. The world is too full of mortals who need joy, too full of occasions that cry out for proper celebration around him. As consciousness fully returns, he becomes aware of his usual companions stirring to wakefulness. The satyrs emerge first, those half-human followers whose goat legs and mischievous grins make them perfect companions for a god who values laughter over dignity. They shake dew from their shaggy coats and begin the day with music, pulling reed pipes from hidden pockets and filling the morning air with melodies that seem to rise directly from the earth itself. The Maenads wake more slowly. Women who have chosen to follow Dionysus in his wanderings, trading the security of settled life for the intoxication of constant celebration. They stretch like cats in the morning sun, their hair still adorned with yesterday's flowers, their eyes bright with the particular contentment that comes from a life lived without the burden of too much planning or worry about tomorrow. Together, this unlikely family represents everything Dionysus loves about the blending of mortal and divine. The satyrs bring their earthy wisdom and irrepressible humor, understanding as few do that laughter is not merely entertainment but a form of prayer, a way of acknowledging the absurd beauty of existence. The Maenads contribute their human perspective, their ability to find ecstasy in simple pleasures, their knowledge of how precious joy becomes when viewed from the perspective of those whose time is limited. This morning, however, as Dionysus shares breakfast with his companions, fresh bread still warm from yesterday's village, honey that drips golden in the slanted sunlight, grapes picked from vines that seem to ripen at his very presence, his thoughts keep returning to the vision that had come to him the night before. The idea of the vineyard picnic continues to shimmer in his mind like heat waves over summer stones. Growing more detailed and more appealing with each moment of consideration, he describes his inspiration to his followers as they eat. Word pictures of blankets spread between rows of heavy-laden vines, of mortals and immortals sharing food and wine in perfect harmony with the landscape that provides both. He speaks of music that would rise naturally from such a gathering, not performed from a stage, but emerging spontaneously from the joy of the moment, weaving together into melodies as complex and satisfying as the finest wine. The satyrs listen, with growing excitement, their eyes lighting up as they imagine the possibilities for mischief and merriment such an event might provide. They begin suggesting embellishments, perhaps flowers woven into garlands to mark the boundaries of the celebration. Maybe special wines mixed with herbs that would enhance the natural beauty of the vineyard setting. Certainly dancing that would flow between the vine rows like a river of joy. The Maenads contribute their own ideas, their mortal perspective, adding practical considerations that their divine companions might otherwise overlook. They speak of foods that would complement wine while being easy to share in an outdoor setting, soft cheeses and fresh bread, olives cured in herbs, fruits that could be eaten by hand while reclining on comfortable blankets. They suggest timing the gathering for late afternoon, when the heat of the day has begun to fade, but enough light remains to fully appreciate the beauty of the vineyard setting as the conversation continues. Animated by the infectious enthusiasm that seems to surround Dionysus wherever he goes, the god finds his vision becoming more concrete, more achievable. What had begun as a dreamy inspiration is taking shape as an actual plan, complete with details and possibilities he had not initially considered. The more they discuss it, the more convinced he becomes that this vineyard picnic could indeed be something special, something that would capture the very essence of what he represents to mortals and immortals alike. Yet even as excitement builds, among his little band of followers, Dionysus remains blissfully unaware of the challenges his vision might encounter. When it meets the unpredictable reality of actual implementation, in his divine optimism, he sees only the golden possibilities, the perfect harmony of elements that will surely result when his careful planning meets the natural bounty of a well-tended vineyard. The sun continues its slow climb across the morning sky, painting new patterns of light and shadow across the landscape where gods and their followers break their fast and dream of celebrations yet to come. Somewhere in the distance, a shepherd's pipe adds its lonely melody to the symphony of morning sounds. While closer at hand, bees work among wildflowers with the same dedicated focus that Dionysus brings to his planning of perfect joy. The day stretches ahead with infinite possibility, a blank canvas waiting for the brushstrokes of divine inspiration and mortal enthusiasm. Soon, very soon, the god of wine and celebration will begin the practical work of transforming his beautiful vision into beautiful reality. The world's first vineyard picnic awaits, shimmering in the near future like a promise of joy too wonderful to be true. The ancient Mediterranean world knew vines as intimately as a mother knows her child's heartbeat. Long before Dionysus conceived his revolutionary notion of the vineyard picnic, the cultivation of grapes had woven itself into the very fabric of civilization, creating landscapes that breathed with the rhythm of seasons and the patient wisdom of generations who understood that the finest things in life cannot be rushed. Picture, if you will, the terraced hillsides that step down toward the wind-dark sea like giant amphitheaters built for an audience of gods. Here, stone walls weathered smooth by countless seasons supported careful rows of vines, each plant positioned with the precision of a master craftsman who knows that the angle of sun and the flow of water can mean the difference between nectar and vinegar. These were not merely agricultural enterprises, but works of art. Collaborations between human ingenuity and divine blessing that transformed barren slopes into gardens of liquid gold. The vines themselves told stories in their gnarled wood and reaching tendrils. Some had stood for generations, their trunks thick as a man's waist, their roots reaching deep into soil enriched by the memories of countless harvests. Others were young and eager, their slim branches reaching toward the sun with the enthusiasm of youth, not yet understanding that the sweetest fruit comes only to those willing to wait for perfect ripeness. Between the rows, earth spoke its own language of fertility and promise. Dark soil crumbled rich between farmers' fingers, telling tales of rain and sun, of careful tending and patient waiting. Here grew the herbs that would later flavor the wine-wild thyme that released its fragrance when crushed underfoot, oregano that painted the ground with tiny white flowers, fennel that stood tall and feathery like nature's own exclamation points of joy. The people who tended these vineyards lived in harmony with rhythms older than memory. They rose with the sun and worked until shadows grew long, their movements guided by generations of accumulated knowledge about when to prune and when to harvest, when to water and when to wait for rain. Their hands stained purple during harvest season bore the marks of their partnership with the earth, calluses that told stories of vines coaxed to maximum sweetness through careful attention and loving care. In the villages that nestled among these vine-covered hills, life revolved around the grape's annual cycle as surely as the moon revolves around the earth. Spring brought the tender excitement of new growth, tiny buds swelling on winter-bare branches like promises written in green ink. Farmers would walk their rows in the soft morning light, examining each plant with the attention a poet gives to, finding exactly the right word, pruning here, encouraging there. Always working in partnership with forces larger than themselves, summer intensified the drama, bringing the long, hot days that slowly concentrated sugar in the growing grapes. This was the season of careful vigilance, when farmers watched the sky for signs of storm and examined their fruit for evidence of disease or pest damage. Children learned to move quietly through the vineyards during these months, understanding instinctively that the grapes were engaged in the mysterious alchemy of transformation that would eventually become wine. But it was autumn that brought the true magic, when the grapes hung heavy and purple, ready for the harvest that would determine the fortune of families and the flavor of celebrations to come. The entire community would mobilize for this crucial work, young and old working side by side, to bring in the fruit at the perfect moment of ripeness. Laughter echoed between the rows as workers raced to fill their baskets, their voices joining. In songs that had been sung at harvest time since the world was young, the pressing of the grapes became a celebration in itself, with barefoot dancers treading the fruit in great stone vats while musicians played and children clapped in rhythm. Purple juice flowed like liquid sunshine, carrying with it the essence of soil and sun and careful human tending. This was the moment when the year's work transformed into liquid potential. When the partnership between mortal effort and divine blessing revealed its first fruits, the wine that emerged from this process carried within it the memory of everything that had contributed to its creation. Each sip told the story of the particular hillside where the grapes had grown, the character of the season that had nurtured them, the skill of the hands that had guided their transformation. To drink wine was to taste the very essence of place and time, to participate in a communion that connected the drinker to the land and to all those who had shared in its cultivation. It was into this world of ancient knowledge and sacred partnership with the earth that Dionysus brought his vision of the vineyard picnic. He understood, as perhaps only a god could, that the vineyards were already places of celebration, already sites where mortal and divine worked together to create something beautiful. His innovation lay not in bringing joy to these places, but in recognizing that the joy was already there, waiting to be acknowledged and amplified through the simple act of gathering to appreciate it properly. The god had walked these vineyards, paths countless times, blessing the vines with his presence and ensuring good harvests for those who honored him with proper reverence. He had seen the workers pause in their labors to share bread and cheese in whatever shade they could find, had watched children play games between the rows while their parents worked, had observed the natural tendency of people to turn work into celebration whenever possible. But now, as he contemplated his grand experiment, Dionysus began to see these familiar landscapes with new eyes. What if, instead of merely blessing the vineyards from afar, he were to make them the actual setting for celebration? What if the natural beauty and abundance that surrounded the vines became not just the source of wine but the venue for its proper appreciation? The more he considered this possibility, the more perfectly suited the vineyards seemed for his purposes. Here was natural beauty that required no enhancement, shade provided by the vines themselves, and the symbolic appropriateness of celebrating wine in the very place where it was born. The terraced hillsides would provide natural amphitheater seating. The stone walls would offer convenient surfaces for spreading food, and the vine rows would create intimate spaces for small groups while allowing for easy movement between different areas of the celebration. Most importantly, the vineyards already possessed that quality of sacred space that Dionysus recognized as essential for true celebration. These were places where human effort had collaborated with divine blessing to create beauty and abundance. The rhythms of work and rest had been perfectly balanced over generations of careful attention. To hold his picnic here would not be to impose celebration upon an inappropriate setting, but to recognize and honor the celebratory nature that already existed. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen and the quality of light shifted toward the golden tones that would later be called the magic hour by those who understood its power to transform ordinary scenes into visions of paradise, Dionysus felt his excitement building somewhere among these countless vineyards that dotted the Mediterranean landscape like scattered jewels. There would be the perfect setting for his experiment. All he needed to do was find it. The search for the ideal vineyard would become its own adventure. He realized an opportunity to explore the infinite variety that existed within what might seem from a distance to be similar landscapes. Each vineyard would have its own character, its own particular combination of exposure to sun and protection from wind, its own relationship with the surrounding countryside, its own community of people who tended it with love and pride. As the day drew toward its close and thoughts turned naturally toward evening meals and comfortable rest, Dionysus smiled with the satisfaction of a god whose plan was taking shape in the most pleasing way possible. Tomorrow would begin his search for the perfect vineyard, and with it, The next phase of his journey toward creating something the world had never seen before, the very first vineyard picnic, a celebration that would bring together all the elements he loved most about mortal existence in a setting that honored both human achievement and divine blessing. The vines rustled softly in the evening breeze, their leaves whispering secrets about sweetness and fermentation, about patient growth and the rewards that come to those willing to wait for perfect timing. Soon, very soon, one of these peaceful vineyards would become the stage for an experiment in joy that would echo through history like the memory of perfect wine. Shared among friends under stars just beginning to appear in the deepening sky, the inspiration had come to Dionysus, like wine slowly warming in the afternoon sun gradually, gently, with a richness that deepened the longer he allowed it to rest in his divine consciousness. Now, as he wandered through the dappled morning light filtering through ancient olive groves, the god found himself turning the idea over and over in his mind, like a vintner examining grapes for perfect ripeness, searching for any flaw in what seemed to him an absolutely brilliant concept. The problem, if it could be called a problem, was that Dionysus had never been entirely satisfied with the way mortals typically honored him. Oh, the festivals were splendid enough. Certainly great processions through city streets, elaborate theatrical performances, symposiums where philosophers debated the nature of existence while consuming impressive quantities of wine. But there was something about these formal celebrations that felt, to his way of thinking, just slightly removed from the natural joy he represented. Picture him now, pausing beside a spring that bubbled up from rocks worn smooth by countless seasons of flowing water. He cups the cool liquid in his palms and drinks deeply, tasting in it the essence of the earth itself, minerals drawn from deep stone that fell on distant mountains. The patient work of time and pressure that had brought this water to exactly this moment of refreshment. This, he thinks, is what celebration should feel like. Natural, spontaneous, rising from the deep places where life itself springs eternal. The formal festivals, for all their grandeur, often struck him as too planned, too separated from the daily rhythm of mortal existence. Mortals would work for months to prepare elaborate costumes and rehearse complex rituals, transforming what should be joyous spontaneity into something that felt more like a theatrical performance than authentic celebration. They would gather in specially designated spaces, temples, and theaters, in public squares as if joy could only properly exist within certain prescribed boundaries. But what if? Dionysus mused as he continued his wandering. Celebration could arise more naturally from the landscape itself. What if instead of creating artificial spaces for joy, they could recognize and honor the celebratory potential that already existed in the places where wine was born? The vineyards themselves were already beautiful, already abundant, already infused with the sacred partnership between mortal effort and divine blessing that made wine possible in the first place. The god's imagination began to paint pictures of extraordinary vividness as he walked. He saw blankets spread directly among the vines, woven from the softest wool and dyed in colors that echoed the changing seasons, deep green like new leaves, warm gold like autumn sunshine, rich purple like ripe grapes, ready for harvest. Upon these blankets would be arranged the simple foods that complemented wine perfectly. Bread still warm from village ovens, cheese aged in cool caves, olives that had been cured with herbs gathered from the very hillsides where the celebration would take place. The wine itself would not be served from formal vessels in measured portions, but would flow freely from amphorae, painted with scenes of harvest joy. Their contents mixed with spring water and honey to create drinks that captured the essence of different seasons and moods. There would be light wines for afternoon sipping, stronger vintages for evening conversations, and special blends flavored with herbs and fruits that would surprise the palate while delighting the spirit. Music would arise naturally from such a gathering. It's not performed by hired musicians from distant stages, but emerging spontaneously from the joy of the participants themselves. Someone would produce a lyre from among the picnic supplies. Another would begin singing a harvest song. Children would create rhythm with whatever came to hand: wooden cups, small stones, the natural percussion of clapping hands and stamping feet, The very vines would provide acoustics, their leaves rustling in harmony with human voices raised in celebration. As Dionysus allowed his vision to expand, he began to see how different groups within the celebration would naturally find their own rhythms and activities. The older participants might gather in whatever shade was available, sharing stories and wisdom while sipping wine and appreciating the beauty of the landscape spread before them. Younger celebrants might explore the vineyard rows, playing games that had been improvised for the occasion and discovering the small delights that reward those who look closely at the natural world. Children, he imagined, would be particularly suited to this kind of celebration. Unlike formal festivals, which often required them to remain still and quiet for long periods, the vineyard picnic would give them freedom to move and explore, too. Chase butterflies between the vine rows and help adults gather flowers for impromptu garlands. Their laughter would add its own music to the celebration. Their wonder at simple pleasures would remind the adults of why they had gathered in the first place. The god found himself particularly enchanted by the possibilities for connecting celebration directly with the source of wine itself. Participants could walk among the vines, learning to distinguish between different varieties of grapes, understanding how soil and climate and careful cultivation combined to create the flavors they enjoyed in their cups. Children could learn the ancient songs that had traditionally accompanied harvest work, while adults could share knowledge about the mysterious process by which grape juice transformed into wine. There would be impromptu lessons in vine tending, with experienced farmers showing city dwellers how to read the signs that indicated when grapes were ready for harvest. Guests could participate in the ancient ritual of blessing the vines, each person offering their own prayer for continued abundance while touching the rough bark and feeling the life force that flowed through these patient plants as the day progressed, and shadows shifted across the vineyard landscape. The celebration would naturally evolve to match the changing light and mood. Morning might begin with simple foods and light conversation. Afternoon could bring more elaborate shared meals and deeper discussions, while evening would welcome dancing and the kind of heartfelt singing that emerges when friends gather under stars with wine-loosened tongues and hearts full of gratitude. The beauty of such a celebration, Dionysus realized with growing excitement, was that it would require no artificial enhancement to achieve its effects. The vineyard itself would provide all the decoration needed, with its natural beauty changing constantly as light and shadow played across the landscape. The seasonal nature of grape growing would ensure that each picnic would have its own character spring. Gatherings would celebrate new growth and possibility. Summer events would focus on the patient nurturing required for good fruit. Autumn celebrations would honor the harvest and the transformation of grape into wine. Most importantly, such celebrations would honor both the divine and mortal elements that made wine possible. Participants would be reminded of Dionysus's blessing while also appreciating the human knowledge and effort required to cultivate vines and craft wine. The celebration would become a form of communion between mortal and immortal, a recognition that the finest achievements of civilization arise from a partnership between human intelligence and divine inspiration. As the sun reached its zenith and the heat of the day intensified, Dionysus sought shade beneath a spreading fig tree, whose branches had been shaped by years of wind and weather into a natural pavilion. Here, as he reclined against the smooth trunk and watched light filter through the broad leaves above, he allowed his excitement to build toward decision. This vineyard picnic would not remain merely a beautiful dream, it would become reality. An experiment in celebration that would demonstrate new possibilities for joy. The first step would be finding the perfect setting, a vineyard that possessed all the qualities necessary for his grand experiment. It would need to be beautiful enough to inspire celebration, accessible enough to accommodate guests, and blessed with the kind of natural abundance that would make food and wine taste better simply by virtue of the setting in which they were. Consumed as afternoon shadows began to lengthen and thoughts turned naturally toward evening meals and rest, Dionysus smiled with the satisfaction of a god whose inspiration had matured into genuine intention. Tomorrow would begin the search for his perfect vineyard, and with it, the transformation of dream into reality. The world's first vineyard picnic awaited, shimmering in the near future like a promise of joy too beautiful to be contained within. The realm of imagination alone. The morning that would change everything dawned clear and bright, with the kind of crystalline air that makes distant mountains seem close enough to touch and fills even the most earthbound souls with an inexplicable desire to venture forth into whatever adventures the day might offer. Dionysus woke with his mind already bubbling with plans, his divine consciousness fizzing like new wine in the fermentation jar, ready to transform inspiration into action. His first task, he knew, would be gathering the perfect companions for his grand experiment. This would not be a celebration for just anyone. The success of the world's first vineyard picnic would depend entirely on having exactly the right mix of personalities, skills, and enthusiasms to turn his beautiful vision into beautiful reality. Like a master vintner, blending different grape varieties to create the perfect wine. Dionysus would need to carefully select participants who would complement each other, while contributing their own unique flavors to the overall experience. Satyrs were obvious choices, of course. These delightful half-human creatures had been his companions for so long that he could hardly imagine any celebration without their irrepressible presence. They understood, as few others did, that joy was not meant to be a quiet, contemplative experience, but something that demanded expression through music, laughter, and the kind of enthusiastic dancing that transforms observers into participants almost against their will. Pan was among the first to volunteer when Dionysus described his vision. The great satyr's eyes lit up with mischief as he imagined the possibilities for musical improvisation that a vineyard setting might provide. Think of the acoustics, he said, his voice carrying the rustle of wind through reed pipes, with the vine leaves acting as natural resonators and the terraced hillsides, creating perfect amphitheater conditions. We could make music that would seem to rise from the earth itself, songs that would make the very grapes swell with pleasure at hearing themselves properly celebrated. The younger satyrs gathered around as Pan spoke, their goat legs dancing with excitement as they began to envision their roles in this unprecedented celebration. Marsyas volunteered to compose new songs specifically for the occasion, melodies that would capture the essence of vineyard life while remaining simple enough for mortal guests to learn and join in. Silenus, oldest and wisest of the satyrs, offered to oversee the wine service, his ancient knowledge of vintages and proper mixing techniques, ensuring that every cup served would be perfectly suited to the moment and the company. The Maenads required a different sort of persuasion. These mortal women who had chosen to follow Dionysus possessed a fierce independence that made them valuable companions, but sometimes difficult to organize for specific purposes. They lived so completely in the present moment, so fully embraced the spontaneous nature of divine celebration, that the very concept of planning ahead struck some of them as potentially limiting to the authentic joy they sought to experience. Agave, their unofficial leader, listened to Dionysus's description with the kind of intense focus she brought to all matters of celebration. Her dark eyes, which had witnessed ecstasies that would drive ordinary mortals to madness, narrowed slightly as she considered the implications of what he was proposing. "You speak of planning and preparation," she said slowly, "of selecting the perfect vineyard and arranging the ideal conditions. But what if the most perfect celebration arises not from planning, but from pure spontaneity? What if your careful arrangements actually prevent the kind of divine madness that produces the most authentic joy?" It was a fair question, one that went to the heart of Dionysus's own concerns about the project. He understood Agave's point. Some of his most memorable celebrations had indeed arisen spontaneously, erupting like geysers of joy from the intersection of the right people, the right mood, and the right moment of divine inspiration. But he also sensed that this vineyard picnic could represent something different. A new form of celebration that combined careful attention to setting and circumstance with the spontaneous joy that was his signature gift to the world. Think of it not as limiting spontaneity, he suggested, but as creating the perfect conditions for spontaneity to flourish. A gardener prepares the soil not to control what grows there, but to ensure that whatever does grow will be as beautiful and abundant as possible. In the same way, our careful preparation will simply ensure that when inspiration strikes, as it surely will, we'll find the most fertile ground possible for its expression. The metaphor seemed to resonate with the Maenads, who understood, perhaps better than anyone, the importance of timing and conditions in matters of divine inspiration. Slowly, one by one, they began to volunteer their own contributions to the planned celebration. Ino offered to gather the most beautiful flowers available, creating garlands and decorations that would enhance the natural beauty of the vineyard without overwhelming it. Otanu volunteered to coordinate with mortal communities in the area, ensuring that local people would feel welcomed rather than displaced by the divine celebration taking place in their midst. But it was the mortals themselves who presented the most interesting challenge. Unlike satyrs and Maenads, who lived primarily for celebration and understood intuitively what Dionysus was trying to achieve, ordinary human beings had their own concerns, obligations, and limitations that needed to be considered. They had families to feed and work to complete, social obligations and personal relationships that couldn't simply be set aside for the sake of an experimental picnic. However divinely inspired, Dionysus found himself in the unusual position of having to think like a mortal, considering practical questions of timing, accessibility, and the kind of invitation that would attract the right sort of participants without overwhelming the celebration with curious crowds who might not understand the spirit of what was being attempted. He needed people who could appreciate the novelty of what he was offering while also contributing their own enthusiasm and creativity to make the event successful. The solution, when it came to him, was elegantly simple. Rather than trying to attract large crowds of strangers, he would focus on the communities that already lived and worked among the vineyards. People who understood intimately the rhythms of grape growing and winemaking, who would naturally appreciate a celebration that honored both the process and the product of their daily labors. These were people who already lived in partnership with the vines, who understood the patient work required to coax sweetness from the earth, who celebrated each successful harvest with the kind of heartfelt gratitude that comes from knowing how many things must align perfectly to produce good wine. They would bring to the vineyard picnic their own knowledge and traditions, their own songs and stories, their own understanding of how wine connects people to the land and to each other. The village of Ampelos, nestled among some of the finest vineyard slopes in all of Attica, seemed like the perfect place to begin this outreach. The people there had been growing grapes for generations, passing down knowledge and techniques that had been refined over centuries of careful observation and experimentation. They understood wine not just as a product to be consumed, but as a living expression of the partnership between human skill and divine blessing. When Dionysus appeared in their village square, one golden afternoon, accompanied by only a few of his most diplomatically skilled companions, he was received with the kind of respectful enthusiasm that comes naturally to people who recognize genuine divinity when they encounter it. These were not sophisticated city dwellers who might question his intentions or worry about the implications of hosting a divine celebration, but practical country people who understood that the blessing of the gods was essential to their prosperity. Village elder, a weathered man named Ikarios, whose hands bore the purple stains of countless harvest seasons, listened carefully as Dionysus described his vision of the vineyard picnic. His eyes bright with the wisdom that comes from a lifetime of reading weather signs and grape conditions, lit up as he began to understand what the god was proposing. "You speak of celebrating wine where wine is born," Ikarios said slowly, his voice carrying the cadence of one accustomed to choosing words carefully, of bringing together all the elements that make wine possible: the vines, the soil, the weather, the human skill, the divine blessing, and honoring them in their proper place rather than in some distant temple or city square. This is wisdom, Lord Dionysus. This is a celebration that honors both the gift and the giver, both the blessing and those who receive it. As word of the planned vineyard picnic spread through Ampelos, excitement began to build in ways that Dionysus found deeply satisfying. This was not the fevered anticipation that sometimes preceded his more dramatic celebrations, but a quieter, more sustainable enthusiasm that suggested people understood what he was trying to achieve and wanted to be part of making it successful. Families began volunteering contributions, special foods that would complement wine while being easy to share in an outdoor setting. hand-woven blankets that could serve as communal seating, musical instruments that could provide accompaniment for spontaneous singing. Children practiced songs they had learned at their grandparents' knees, while adults shared memories of harvest celebrations and traditional games that might be appropriate for the vineyard setting. As preparations gathered, momentum and the day of the great experiment drew closer. Dionysus found himself increasingly confident that his beautiful vision would indeed become beautiful reality. He had assembled the perfect combination of divine enthusiasm and mortal practicality, spontaneous joy and careful preparation, of respect for tradition and excitement about innovation. The stage was set. The players were assembled, and the perfect vineyard had been identified. Soon, very soon, the world would witness something entirely new, a celebration that honored wine by taking place among the very vines that made wine possible. It's a gathering that would demonstrate new possibilities for the ancient art of bringing people together in joy. The chosen morning arrived wrapped in mist that clung to the vineyard. Terraces like silk scarves draped across the shoulders of sleeping giants. As the sun climbed higher, burning away the gentle fog, it revealed a landscape that seemed to have been prepared by nature herself for exactly this purpose. Row upon row of heavy-laden vines stepping down the hillside in perfect symmetry, there. Leaves catching the light like scattered emeralds, while purple clusters of grapes hung ready for harvest in the warming air. Dionysus arrived at the vineyard of Ikarios, just as the dew was beginning to evaporate, bringing with him a sense of barely contained excitement that seemed to shimmer around his divine form like heat waves over sun-warmed stones. He had chosen this particular vineyard not only for its exceptional beauty, though the terrace slopes and ancient stone walls created a natural amphitheater of extraordinary charm, but for the quality of welcome he had received from its mortal custodians and the deep sense of partnership between human effort and divine blessing that permeated every carefully tended vine. The preparations had been proceeding since before dawn, with satyrs and maenads working alongside mortal villagers in a harmony that delighted the god's heart. Pan had positioned himself and his fellow musicians among the vine rows, testing the acoustics and discovering to his joy that the terrace landscape did indeed create natural resonance chambers that amplified music in the most pleasing way. His experimental melodies seemed to rise from the earth itself, weaving together with the morning sounds of awakening birds and the distant bleating of goats on higher hillsides. Meanwhile, the maenads had transformed themselves into coordinators of domestic magic, their wild energy channeled into the creation of beauty, a comfort that would enhance rather than overwhelm the natural setting. Ino had woven garlands of ivy and late-blooming wildflowers that seemed to grow naturally from the stone walls and wooden supports of the vineyard, creating decorations so subtle and appropriate that it appeared to have been placed there by some particularly artistic woodland spirit. The mortals from Amplos had arrived carrying contributions that spoke to generations of understanding about what made celebrations both beautiful and memorable. Wooden tables crafted from olive wood so old it had achieved an almost metallic hardness were positioned at strategic points throughout the vineyard, their surfaces already laden with the kind of simple foods that complement wine while encouraging conversation and lingering enjoyment. There were wheels of cheese aged in caves that imparted subtle flavors of earth and time, their surfaces decorated with herbs that had been gathered from the very hillsides visible from the vineyard. Loaves of bread, still warm from village ovens, and fragrant with the yeast that had been carefully maintained by the same families for generations, were arranged alongside dishes of olives that gleamed like black pearls in their pools of golden oil flavored with wild thyme and rosemary. The wine itself had been chosen with the same care that a master musician brings to selecting instruments for a concert. Amphorae of different sizes and ages contained vintages that represented not just different years but different moods and occasions, light, refreshing wines perfect for afternoon sipping under the dappled shade of the vines, deeper, more complex varieties suitable for the serious conversations that emerge when friends gather to share their thoughts about life and meaning, and special ceremonial blends that Dionysus himself had blessed for this inaugural celebration. As the morning progressed and more guests began to arrive, the vineyard filled with a gentle murmur of appreciation and wonder that told Dionysus's experiment was already succeeding beyond his most optimistic expectations. People moved through the terraced rows with the kind of reverential pleasure that comes from experiencing something beautiful that has been created specifically for their enjoyment, yet which enhances rather than competes with the natural beauty that serves as its foundation. Children, as Dionysus had hoped, took to the vineyard setting with the kind of immediate enthusiasm that adults often lose but never stop envying. They played games of hide-and-seek among the vine rows, their laughter creating a musical counterpoint to the more formal entertainment provided by Pan's musicians. Their natural curiosity about the growing grapes led to impromptu lessons from experienced farmers, delighted in sharing their knowledge with young minds, eager to understand the mysteries of cultivation and fermentation. The teenagers and young adults gravitated toward areas where the natural terracing created intimate conversation spaces, allowing for the kind of earnest discussions about life, love, the nature of existence that seem to flow as naturally as wine when people gather in beautiful settings without the pressure of formal entertainment or scheduled activities. Some organized impromptu competitions, seeing who could identify different wines while blindfolded, creating spontaneous poetry about the beauty of the vineyard setting, or learning the traditional songs that had been sung during harvest time. For generations beyond counting, the older participants found their own rhythms within the celebration, many gravitating toward areas that offered comfortable seating and expansive views of the surrounding countryside. Here, conversations tended toward the sharing of wisdom and memory, with experienced vintners explaining the subtle signs that indicated when grapes had reached perfect ripeness, while village elders told stories about legendary harvests and the weather patterns that made certain years memorable for their exceptional wine. What struck Dionysus most forcefully as he moved through the celebration, sampling conversations and observing interactions with the keen attention that came naturally to a god whose domain was the creation and maintenance of joy, was how perfectly the vineyard setting enhanced every aspect of the gathering. The natural beauty eliminated any need for artificial entertainment, while the terrace landscape created natural groupings that allowed people to find exactly the level of social interaction they desired at any given moment. The presence of the growing vines themselves added a dimension to the celebration that no indoor venue could have provided. Guests found themselves naturally curious about the cultivation process, asking questions about pruning and harvesting, soil preparation, and weather patterns, the mysterious transformation by which grape juice became wine. These conversations created connections between city dwellers and rural residents, between those who consumed wine and those who produced it, that would never have developed in a more conventional setting. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen and the quality of light shifted toward the golden tones that photographers would later recognize as magical, the character of the celebration evolved in ways that seemed entirely natural yet somehow orchestrated by invisible forces of perfect timing. The musicians began playing melodies that encouraged dancing, and people began moving between the vine rows with the kind of spontaneous choreography that emerges when hearts are light and wine has loosened the inhibitions that normally keep bodies still. The dancing that developed was unlike anything typically seen at formal festivals, more flowing, more connected to the landscape, more responsive to the natural rhythms of earth and season. Partners changed frequently and without ceremony. Children danced with adults. Strangers became friends through the simple act of moving together to music that seemed to rise from the vineyard itself. Meanwhile, the food service had evolved into something resembling a continuous feast, with people sharing whatever they had brought while discovering new combinations and flavors, created by the mingling of different families' contributions. Wine flowed freely, but never excessively. The outdoor setting and natural pacing of the day somehow encouraging moderation while maximizing appreciation for the subtle complexities that distinguished one vintage from another as the sun continued its slow journey toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades that perfectly complemented the purple of the ripening grapes. Dionysus felt a deep satisfaction settling over his divine consciousness like a comfortable cloak. His experiment was not merely succeeding, it was revealing its possibilities for celebration that he had only dimly imagined when the original inspiration at first whispered itself into his awareness. The vineyard picnic was demonstrating that joy, need not be separated from the daily activities that sustain life, that celebration could enhance rather than compete with work, that the most profound pleasures emerged not from elaborate artificial entertainments, but from the simple act of appreciating beauty, abundance, in community in their proper natural settings, yet even as satisfaction filled his heart like wine filling a cup. Dionysus remained alert to the subtle currents of energy and mood that flowed through any gathering of enthusiastic celebrants. He could sense, with the intuition that comes from millennia of experience in managing divine celebrations, that the perfect harmony of the morning and early afternoon was beginning to shift towards something more complex, more unpredictable, more likely to produce the kind of memorable chaos that makes the best stories, but also the most interesting challenges for those responsible for maintaining some semblance of order and safety. The wine was beginning to take effect. Conversations were becoming more animated. The natural exuberance of satyrs and maenads was starting to influence even the most reserved mortal participants. The stage was being set for the next phase of the world's first vineyard picnic, a phase that would test both Dionysus's divine management skills and his fundamental assumptions about the relationship between careful planning and spontaneous celebration. As the afternoon sun reached its peak and began its slow descent toward the western hills, painting the vineyard in increasingly golden light, the careful harmony that had characterized the morning hours began to shift into something altogether more chaotic, more unpredictable, and infinitely more challenging for a god who was discovering that even divine planning could not account for every variable in the complex equation of celebration, involving both mortals and immortals. The first sign of impending complications came from Silenus, the oldest and most experienced of the satyrs, whose ancient wisdom about wine and its effects should have made him the most reliable member of the serving staff. However, Silenus had been sampling rather liberally from the various amphorae as he went about his duties, ostensibly to ensure that each wine was being served at the proper temperature and had achieved the ideal balance of flavors. His dedication to quality control, while admirable in principle, had left him somewhat unsteady on his hooves and increasingly creative in his interpretations of proper wine service, when a group of village elders requested a light, refreshing wine suitable for afternoon conversation. Silenus enthusiastically provided them with an amphora of his own special blenda, mixture that combined 3 different vintages with honey, herbs, and what appeared to be a generous portion of the strong mountain wine, typically reserved for religious ceremonies. The result was a drink that was neither light nor refreshing, but which possessed such unexpected complexity and potency that the village elders found themselves engaged in philosophical discussions of unprecedented depth and volume. Meanwhile, Pan had become so enchanted with the acoustic properties of the terraced vineyard that he had begun experimenting with increasingly complex musical arrangements, encouraging other musicians to join him in elaborate harmonies that utilized every natural resonance chamber the landscape provided. What had begun as gentle background music suitable for conversation and casual socializing gradually evolved into a full concert that demanded attention and participation from everyone within hearing range. The effect was magical but overwhelming, as panpipes, lyres, and drums combined with human voices to create music of such compelling beauty that people throughout the vineyard found themselves drawn away from their conversations and activities to listen, participate, or dance along. The careful balance between intimate groupings and communal celebration that had characterized the earlier hours began to dissolve as everyone gravitated toward the musicians, creating a single large crowd where before there had been many comfortable, smaller gatherings. The maenads had shown admirable restraint during the morning hours, began to feel the irresistible pull of their true nature as the wine and music worked their ancient magic on both divine and mortal consciousness. Ino, who had been so careful in her flower arrangements, suddenly found herself seized by the urge to dance with such abandon that her carefully placed garlands were scattered to the winds as she spun and leaped between the vine rows with her, hair flying free and her eyes bright with divine madness. The sight of a maenad in full celebration mode had a contagious effect on many of the mortal women present, who felt stirring within themselves echoes of the same wild joy that had once called their ancestresses to abandon conventional behavior and dance on mountaintops under the full moon. One by one, they began to join Eno's ecstatic dance, their movements growing progressively freer and more expressive as wine and music and the intoxicating example of divine abandon combined to overwhelm the social inhibitions that normally govern their behavior. The men, both mortal and immortal, watched this display with reactions that ranged from delighted appreciation to growing concern about where such unleashed enthusiasm might lead. Some joined the dancing, adding their own energy to what was rapidly becoming a whirlwind of movement and laughter that swept through the vineyard like a summer storm. Beautiful and powerful, but increasingly difficult to control or predict, Dionysus found himself in the peculiar position of watching his carefully planned celebration transform into exactly the kind of spontaneous, divine madness that Agave had originally suggested might be preferable to organized festivity. On one hand, he could not help but feel pleased that his vineyard picnic had succeeded in creating conditions where such authentic joy could flourish. On the other hand, he was beginning to worry about the practical consequences of allowing several dozen mortals and immortals to achieve full celebratory abandon in the middle of a working vineyard during harvest season. The children, who had been delighting in the freedom to explore and play among the vines, began to take their cues from the increasingly wild behavior of their elders. What had been innocent games of hide-and-seek evolved into more elaborate adventures that involved climbing on the wooden supports that held up the vine terraces, sampling grapes directly from the vines without regard for which ones were ripe, and creating their own percussion ensemble using whatever makeshift instruments they could improvise from picnic supplies and agricultural equipment. The teenagers, caught between childhood and adulthood, and therefore naturally inclined toward testing boundaries, seized upon the increasingly permissive atmosphere to engage in behaviors that would have been strictly forbidden under normal circumstances. Some began organizing contests to see who could drink wine mixed with increasingly exotic ingredients, while others started elaborate games that involved racing through the vineyard rows while carrying filled cups, inevitably resulting in purple stains on clothing and increasing slipperiness underfoot. It was the combination of spilled wine and wet and enthusiastic dancing that created the first genuine crisis of the afternoon. The grape harvest had left the ground between the vine rows somewhat soft and uneven to begin with, and the addition of increasing quantities of spilled wine, some accidentally dropped, some deliberately poured as impromptu libations to Dionysus, had created patches of treacherous footing that proved challenging even for participants whose coordination had not been compromised by generous wine consumption. The inevitable accident occurred when Marcius, the young satyr who had composed special songs for the occasion, attempted in a particularly athletic leap between vine rows while playing his panpipes, and discovered too late that the ground where he intended to land had been transformed into something resembling purple mud. His spectacular tumble, while not dangerous, was sufficiently dramatic to inspire laughter and applause from observers, which in turn encouraged other participants to attempt their own aerial acrobatics with predictably chaotic results. Within a remarkably short time, what had been elegant dancing had devolved into a kind of organized mud wrestling, with participants slipping, sliding, and laughing as they discovered that maintaining dignity was considerably more difficult when the ground beneath their feet had been transformed into a purple skating rink. Clothes became stained beyond any hope of cleaning. Hair became decorated with grape leaves and mud, and the careful arrangements of food and wine service began to suffer as servers found it increasingly difficult to navigate between serving areas without mishap. Ikarios, the village elder who had been so enthusiastic about hosting the vineyard picnic, watched the developing chaos with the philosophical resignation of someone who had lived long enough to understand that even the best planned celebrations could take unexpected turns. His primary concern was not the temporary mess grape stains would wash out eventually, and mud would dry and brush away, but the potential for more serious accidents as the afternoon progressed, and wine continued to take its effect on participants, whose judgment might already be somewhat compromised. Lord Dionysus, He approached the god during a relatively quiet moment, when most of the immediate chaos was concentrated in a different section of the vineyard. Perhaps it is time to consider providing some gentle guidance about the proper pace of celebration. The afternoon is still young, and we have many hours yet before evening brings natural conclusion to our gathering. If the current level of enthusiasm continues to escalate at its present rate, I fear we may exhaust our capacity for enjoyment. Before the sun sets, it was wise counsel, delivered with the diplomatic skill that comes from years of managing community. Celebrations and understanding the delicate balance between joy and excess that determines whether gatherings are remembered fondly or become cautionary tales. Dionysus recognized the truth in Icarius's observation. Even as he struggled with the fundamental tension between his desire to see mortals experience authentic divine joy and his responsibility to ensure that such experiences did not result in harm or lasting regret. The challenge, as he was learning, lay not in creating conditions where celebration could flourish. That part of his experiment had succeeded beyond his wildest expectations, but in finding ways to guide and moderate such celebrations so that they enhanced rather than overwhelmed the participants. Wine and music in beautiful settings could indeed produce transcendent joy, but they could also produce transcendent chaos if not balanced with wisdom, moderation, and careful attention to the human limitations that even divine celebration must acknowledge. As shouts of laughter echoed from the section of vineyard where the impromptu mud wrestling was still in progress, and as Pan's music continued to weave its spell over dancers, whose movements had become increasingly creative and increasingly dangerous, Dionysus found himself facing the first great learning opportunity of his vineyard picnic experiment. Afternoon was far from over, and the lessons were just beginning. The moment of recognition came to Dionysus, like the first cool breeze of evening after a sweltering day, subtle at first, and unmistakably refreshing in its clarity. Standing amid the delightful chaos of his vineyard picnic, watching mortals and immortals alike navigate the increasingly treacherous terrain of purple mud and scattered grape leaves, he suddenly understood that the very mishaps unfolding before him contained within them the seeds of wisdom he had not expected to discover. A spilled cup of wine, gleaming dark as garnets in the slanted afternoon light, had become the center of an impromptu lesson in physics as children gathered around to observe how the liquid flowed differently depending on the slope of the ground and the density of fallen leaves. Their scientific curiosity, undiminished by the chaos surrounding them, reminded the god that even accidents could become opportunities for learning and wonder if approached with the right spirit. Nearby, an elderly woman from Amphilos sat peacefully on a stone wall, calmly removing her muddy sandals and laughing as she watched younger celebrants attempt to maintain their dignity while navigating the slippery conditions. Her contentment, undisturbed by the mess that might have distressed a more fastidious personality, spoke to a deeper understanding about the relationship between perfection and enjoyment that Dionysus found himself eager to explore. "My lord," she called to him with the easy familiarity that wine and celebration had fostered throughout the afternoon. "Come sit with me a moment and help me solve a puzzle that has been troubling my mind." Intrigued, Dionysus made his way carefully across the treacherous ground and settled beside her on the sun-warmed stones. "What puzzle is that, good grandmother?" Her eyes, bright with the kind of mischief that seems to grow more pronounced rather than less as people age gracefully, focused on the scene before them. "I have been watching our celebration transform from the orderly beauty of morning into the magnificent chaos of afternoon, and I find myself wondering, which version brings more joy to the human heart?" Was exactly the question that had been forming in Dionysus's own consciousness, though he had not yet articulated it so clearly. The morning had indeed been beautiful, harmonious, elegant, perfectly balanced in ways that satisfied both aesthetic sensibilities and practical needs. But the afternoon, for all its mésalliances and unpredictability, seemed to have generated a different quality of happiness. Something more visceral and immediate, more connected to the kind of unguarded joy that emerges when people stop worrying about appearances and allow themselves to simply experience whatever the moment offers. "Perhaps," he suggested thoughtfully, "the question assumes that we must choose between them. and the truth might be that both serve necessary purposes in the complete experience of celebration. The old woman nodded approvingly. Exactly so. The morning gave us beauty and refinement. The afternoon teaches us resilience and adaptability. The morning showed us wine at its most elegant. The afternoon reveals its power to transform dignity into laughter and laughter into memory. As they spoke, Dionysus found his attention drawn to a group of young men who had discovered that the muddy conditions made traditional competitive activities impossible, but had created opportunities for entirely new forms of entertainment. Unable to wrestle without immediately becoming coated in purple mud, they had invented a game that involved attempting to maintain balance while standing on one foot, with the winner being whoever could remain upright longest while others tried to make them laugh hard enough to lose their composure. The game was absurd, certainly, but it was also generating genuine merriment and creating bonds of friendship between participants who had been strangers when the day began. More importantly, it demonstrated the kind of creative adaptation that Dionysus recognized as one of humanity's most attractive characteristics: the ability to find joy in unexpected circumstances, to transform obstacles into opportunities, to make celebration possible even when conditions were far from perfect. Across the vineyard, other groups were making their own adaptations to the changed conditions. The musicians had moved to higher ground, where footing was more secure, but they had also modified their repertoire to include songs that acknowledged and celebrated the afternoon's mishaps rather than pretending they hadn't occurred. Children, who had exhausted the possibilities for clean games, were inventing new activities that incorporated mud as a feature rather than treating it as an unfortunate accident. Most telling of all, the food service had evolved in ways that demonstrated remarkable creativity under pressure. When it became clear that formal serving arrangements were no longer practical, participants had spontaneously organized a system of informal sharing that was actually more efficient and more sociable than the original plan. People simply picked up whatever food appealed to them and wandered through the vineyard, eating as they went and sharing with whoever they encountered along the way. The wine service, too, had adapted to circumstances in ways that Dionysus found deeply satisfying. Instead of the careful, measured portions that Silenus had been providing earlier, wine was now being shared directly from amphora to cup, with participants taking responsibility for their own consumption while naturally moderating each other through the social pressure that emerges when drinking becomes a visibly communal activity rather than a private choice. You see, the old woman continued, following his gaze as it moved from group to group throughout the vineyard. Perfection has its place in celebration, but so does imperfection. The spilled cup teaches us that wine is meant to flow freely, not to be hoarded or consumed with such careful precision that we forget to appreciate its essential nature. The muddy ground reminds us that earth is where wine begins, and that there is no shame in reconnecting with the source of our pleasures, her. Words resonated with insights that Dionysus had been developing throughout his observations of the afternoon's events. The mishaps had indeed revealed something important about the nature of authentic celebration, that it required not just beauty and abundance and good company, but also the kind of resilience and good humor that could transform accidents into adventures, mistakes into memories, chaos into community. The lesson was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Wine, he realized, was itself a symbol of transformation, grape juice that had been allowed to ferment, to change, to become something entirely different from what it had been originally. In the same way, celebrations that were allowed to evolve, naturally, to respond to unexpected circumstances, to embrace the mesalliances that comes with authentic human participation, often produce more memorable and meaningful experiences than those that maintained perfect order throughout, as if to demonstrate this principle. A light breeze chose that moment to sweep through the vineyard, carrying with it the mingled scents of crushed grapes, spilled wine, trampled herbs, and the earthy richness of soil that had been churned by many feet. The combination was intoxicating in ways that no carefully planned perfume could have achieved. A fragrance that captured the essence of celebration as a living, breathing, evolving experience rather than a static tableau of predetermined beauty. The sound, too, had evolved throughout the afternoon from the gentle murmur of polite conversation to something more complex and more metal, laughter mixing with music. Voices raised in spontaneous song, the splash of footsteps through puddles of spilled wine, the rustle of vine leaves disturbed by passing celebrants. It was the sound of community being born, of strangers becoming friends, of inhibitions being set aside in favor of authentic connection. The spilled cup, Dionysus mused aloud, teaches us that celebration is not about maintaining perfection, but about embracing transformation. Wine changes grape juice into something more complex and more satisfying. Celebration changes strangers into friends, inhibition into joy, ordinary moments into memories that will be treasured for years to come. The old woman smiled and raised her own cup, somewhat muddy now, but filled with wine that tasted no less sweet for the circumstances of its consumption. To the wisdom of spilled cups and muddy feet she toasted, and to gods who are wise, enough to learn from mortals even while teaching them new ways to find joy. As the afternoon continued its slow progression toward evening, Dionysus found himself observing the celebration with new eyes, appreciating not just the successes, but the failures, not just the moments of perfect harmony, but the instances of creative chaos that revealed the resilience and adaptability of both mortal and immortal nature. The vineyard picnic was succeeding, but not in the way he had originally envisioned. It was succeeding in ways that were messier, more complicated, more human, and ultimately more satisfying than his perfect dream had imagined possible. The lesson of the spilled cup was becoming a lesson about the nature of joy itself, that it flourishes not in controlled environments but in conditions that allow for surprise adaptation, and the kind of creative response to challenge that brings out the best in both gods and mortals. As evening approached, and shadows began to lengthen across the purple-stained vineyard, Dionysus felt his understanding of celebration deepening in ways that would influence not just this particular gathering, but all future expressions of divine joy in the mortal world. As evening painted the sky in shades of rose and amber that perfectly complemented the purple stains adorning both landscape and celebrants, Dionysus found himself contemplating the deeper implications of what had unfolded. Throughout this extraordinary day, the vineyard picnic, in all its messy, chaotic, unexpectedly beautiful reality, had revealed truths about celebration and community that would echo through the ages like the lingering notes of a perfect melody. The most immediate legacy was visible in the faces of the participants themselves. Despite their mud-stained clothing and grape leaf-decorated hair, despite the various minor mishaps and moments of undignified tumbling that had punctuated the afternoon, every person in the vineyard wore an expression of deep contentment that spoke to something more profound than mere entertainment. They had experienced something unprecedented, a celebration that honored both the divine and mortal contributions to wine, while creating new possibilities for community and joy. The children, in particular, carried with them memories that would shape their understanding of celebration for the rest of their lives. They had learned that festivals need not be formal, solemn affairs conducted in sacred spaces according to rigid protocols. Instead, they had discovered that the most meaningful celebrations could arise spontaneously from the intersection of natural beauty, good food and wine, pleasant company, and the willingness to embrace whatever unexpected developments the moment might offer. Young Alexios, now barely 8 years old and thoroughly purple from head to toe, approached Dionysus with the serious expression that children wear when they have something important to communicate to adults. "Lord Dionysus," he said with careful formality, "will there be more vineyard picnics? Because I think this is the best kind of celebration anyone has ever invented, and it would be sad if it only happened once." The god's heart swelled with affection for this earnest young mortal who had grasped so immediately what he had been trying to achieve. "What makes you think it's the best kind of celebration?" he asked, genuinely curious about the child's perspective. Alexios considered the question with the gravity it deserved. "It's because everything here belongs together. The wine comes from the grapes come from the vines grow in the ground we're sitting on, and we're all part of it instead of just watching from somewhere else. And when Marcius fell down and got all muddy, everyone laughed, but not in a mean way. And then they helped him up, and gave him more wine, and he made up a song about falling down that was so funny, we all learned it. At the temple festivals, if someone fell down during the ceremony, everyone would be upset, and the priests would have to start over. His analysis revealed an understanding of authenticity and community that many adults struggled to articulate. The Vineyard picnic had succeeded not despite its imperfections, but because of its willingness to embrace and incorporate them into the larger experience of celebration. It had created conditions where accidents became opportunities, where mistakes became memories, where the unexpected enhanced rather than disrupted the overall experience. As news of the Vineyard picnic spread throughout the region in the days and weeks that followed, Dionysus observed with fascination how the concept evolved and adapted to different communities and circumstances. Some groups focused on replicating the outdoor setting, organizing gatherings in olive groves, herb gardens, or beside streams where the natural beauty enhanced the pleasure of sharing food and wine. Others concentrated on the spirit of informal community that had characterized the event, creating celebrations that emphasized participation over performance, adaptation over rigid adherence to predetermined plans. The city of Athens, hearing tales of the remarkable gathering, organized its own version in the public gardens that surrounded the temples of the Acropolis. While the urban setting required certain modifications, stone benches instead of blankets on the ground, purchased wine instead of samples directly from the vineyard. The essential elements of community celebration and connection to the sources of their pleasure were carefully preserved. The Athenian adaptation introduced innovations that Dionysus found particularly interesting. Poets who attended began composing verses specifically designed for communal recitation rather than individual performance, creating a new art form that emphasized participation over passive consumption. Philosophers discovered that wine consumed in natural settings seemed to encourage different kinds of thinking, less abstract and theoretical, more grounded in immediate experience and practical wisdom. The island communities of the Aegean developed their own variations that took advantage of their maritime settings. Celebrations began to incorporate the rhythm of tides and the sound of waves, with participants gathering on beaches where wine could be mixed with seawater and ancient rituals that honored both Dionysus and Poseidon. The combination of wine, sea, air, and the vast horizon visible from seaside locations created a sense of connection to larger cosmic forces that participants found deeply moving and spiritually significant. But perhaps the most significant legacy of the Vineyard picnic was its influence on the development of what would later be called symposiums, the formal drinking parties that became central to Greek intellectual and social life. The symposium tradition incorporated many elements that Dionysus had pioneered in his Vineyard experiment: the careful attention to setting and atmosphere, the integration of food and wine service with conversation and entertainment, the emphasis on community participation rather than passive spectatorship. However, the symposiums also revealed how institutionalization could both preserve and transform innovative ideas. While they maintained the democratic spirit of shared participation that had characterized the Vineyard picnic, they gradually became more formal, more exclusive, more concerned with intellectual content, and less focused on the simple pleasure of community celebration. The spontaneity and muddy authenticity of the original experiment was replaced by elegant discourse and refined entertainment, beautiful in its own way, but fundamentally different in character. Dionysus watched this evolution with the mixed feelings of any innovator who sees their original creation adapted and modified by others. On one hand, he was pleased that the concept had proved sufficiently appealing and useful to be adopted and spread throughout the Greek world. On the other hand, he sometimes regretted the loss of the raw, unpolished joy that had characterized the original Vineyard picnic. The willingness to let celebration evolve naturally without too much concern for maintaining dignity or meeting predetermined expectations. The most faithful inheritors of the Vineyard picnic tradition proved to be the rural communities that lived and worked among the vines themselves. For them, the concept of celebrating wine in its natural setting was not an innovation, but a recognition of practices that had been developing informally for generations. They began organizing harvest festivals that incorporated elements Dionysus, had pioneered communal meals served among the vines, music that arose spontaneously from the joy of the participants, celebration that embraced rather than fought against the mesensis inherent in any gathering of enthusiastic people. These harvest festivals became annual traditions that strengthened community bonds while honoring both the divine blessing that made wine possible and the human effort required to transform that blessing into reality. They created occasions for sharing knowledge about cultivation techniques, for teaching children about the partnership between mortal and immortal that sustained their way of life, for celebrating the successful completion of another year's cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting. The influence of the vineyard picnic extended beyond celebration into the realm of religious practice itself. Traditional temple worship began to incorporate more outdoor elements, more attention to natural settings, more emphasis on community participation rather than priestly performance. The rigid boundaries between sacred and secular spaces began to blur as people discovered that divine presence could be experienced as powerfully in a vineyard or garden as in a formal temple, perhaps more powerfully because of the connection to the natural world that sustained their lives. Centuries later, as Greek culture spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond, the legacy of the vineyard picnic could be traced in countless variations and adaptations. Roman banquets borrowed the emphasis on outdoor settings and seasonal foods. Medieval feast days incorporated the democratic participation and spontaneous entertainment. Renaissance celebrations rediscovered the integration of art, nature, and community that had made the original vineyard picnic so memorable. Even modern picnic traditions, though their participants might not realize it, carry forward elements that Dionysus pioneered in that long-ago vineyard: the preference for natural settings, the emphasis on shared food prepared and consumed communally, the integration of entertainment that arises from the participants themselves rather than being provided by professional performers. As twilight deepened and the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky above the vineyard, Dionysus reflected with deep satisfaction on what had been accomplished. The day had not unfolded according to his original plan, but it had achieved something more valuable than mere adherence. 2. Predetermined expectations. It had demonstrated new possibilities for human celebration, new ways of connecting divine blessing with mortal community, new understandings of how joy could be cultivated and shared. The spilled wine would eventually be absorbed by the earth. The mud would dry and blow away. The stained clothing would be cleaned or discarded. But the memories created in this vineyard, the connections forged between strangers, the innovations and celebration that had emerged from the willingness to embrace imperfection, these would endure, spreading like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, influencing countless future gatherings and inspiring new experiments in the ancient art of bringing people together in joy. The stars emerged one by one in the deepening sky above the vineyard, their gentle light mixing with the fading glow of sunset to create a twilight that seemed designed by some cosmic artist who understood perfectly the mood required for the gentle conclusion of a day that had been filled with discovery, laughter, and the kind of memorable chaos that transforms ordinary moments into treasured memories. Dionysus reclined, now against the stone wall that had supported countless generations of vines. His divine form relaxed into the posture of contentment. That comes to those who have witnessed their dreams take shape in the world, however differently than originally imagined. Around him, the vineyard settled into evening quiet. Though the air still hummed with the lingering energy of celebration and the soft voices of participants reluctant to let such a perfect day come to its natural end, the cleanup, such as it had proceeded with the same spirit of community cooperation that had characterized the entire event. Rather than treating the purple stains and scattered grape leaves as problems to be solved, participants had approached them as evidence of joy experienced and memories created. Children had made games of gathering the flower petals and vine leaves that decorated the ground, while adults had worked together to restore some semblance of order to the food and wine service areas. Though no one seemed particularly concerned about achieving perfect tidiness, the mortals from Ampelos had been the last to prepare for departure. Their reluctance to leave speaking to the success of Dionysus's experiment in ways that formal praise could never have accomplished. They lingered over final cups of wine, exchanged addresses and promises to visit, made plans for future gatherings that would attempt to recapture some of the magic they had experienced in this vineyard setting. Ikarios, the village elder who had been so instrumental in making the vineyard picnic possible, approached the god with steps that were slightly unsteady but eyes that remained bright with satisfaction. "Lord Dionysus," he said, settling carefully. "Beside the recumbent deity, I confess that when you first described your vision of a vineyard picnic, I imagined something quite different from what we have experienced today." The god smiled, his expression carrying both amusement and genuine curiosity. "Different in what way, good Ikarios?" The old man's weathered hands gestured toward the vineyard around them, where evidence of the day's festivities remained visible. "In the gathering darkness, I expected something more orderly, more dignified, more like the temple festivals or civic celebrations I've attended throughout my life. Instead, we have created something entirely new, messy, but also more real, more connected to the actual experience of living and working with the vines that make wine possible." His observation touched on insights that Dionysus had been developing throughout the long day of celebration and mishap. The vineyard picnic had indeed revealed that authenticity often required embracing elements that more formal celebrations typically sought to minimize or eliminate entirely: the unpredictability of weather and ground conditions, the spontaneous energy of participants. It's a kind of creative chaos that emerges when people are encouraged to participate actively rather than observe passively. "Perhaps," Dionysus suggested quietly, his voice carrying the drowsy contentment of evening, "the most meaningful celebrations are those that acknowledge rather than fight against the realities of mortal existence. Wine itself teaches us this. Lesson it is created through fermentation, through controlled chaos, through the transformation of simple grape juice into something more complex and more satisfying, through processes that cannot be entirely controlled or predicted." As they spoke, the last groups of celebrants began their reluctant departures, their voices growing fainter as they made their way through the terraced vineyard toward the paths that would carry them back to their ordinary lives. Yet Dionysus could sense that they carried with them something that would make those ordinary lives subtly richer: new friendships forged in the sharing of wine and laughter, new understandings about the possibilities for joy that existed in even the simplest gatherings, new memories that would brighten many future days with their warmth and humor. The satyrs and maenads, his eternal companions in the pursuit of celebration, had gathered in a loose circle around their divine leader, their faces glowing with the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from participating in something genuinely innovative and successful. Pan still held his pipes, though he played them now with the gentle, dreamy melodies appropriate to evening's quiet rather than the energetic dance tunes that had animated the afternoon's festivities. "Master," said Agave, her voice carrying none of the skepticism that had characterized her initial response to his planning, "today has taught me that there need be no conflict between careful preparation and spontaneous joy. Your vineyard picnic created conditions where authentic celebration could flourish, but it did not attempt to control or direct that celebration once it began to unfold naturally." Her words echoed thoughts that had been forming in Dionysus's mind as he reflected on the day's lessons. The success of the vineyard picnic lay not in its adherence to any predetermined plan, but in its demonstration that the most satisfying celebrations emerged from the intersection of thoughtful preparation and willing surrender to whatever developments the moment might offer. Like wine itself, celebration required both human skill and divine blessing, both careful attention and patient willingness to allow transformation to occur according to its own mysterious timing. The night air carried the mingled scents of crushed grapes and trampled herbs, of spilled wine slowly being absorbed by thirsty earth, of wood smoke from distant cooking fires where families prepared evening meals, enriched by stories of the day's extraordinary festivities. These fragrances would forever after be associated in Dionysus's divine memory with the satisfaction of innovation successfully achieved, of dreams transformed into reality through the collaborative efforts of mortals and immortals working together. toward a common vision of joy. As the conversation gradually faded into comfortable silence, and his companions settled into the relaxed postures appropriate to evening rest, Dionysus found his thoughts turning toward the future implications of what had been accomplished. The vineyard picnic would not remain unique already. He could sense the ripples of influence spreading outward from this single afternoon, inspiring countless variations and adaptations that would carry the essential insights forward into new contexts and communities. But more than inspiring specific celebrations, the vineyard picnic had demonstrated principles that could transform how mortals understood the relationship between work and joy, between formal religious observance and authentic spiritual experience, between individual pleasure and community celebration. These insights would influence not just how people celebrated wine, but how they approached the entire challenge of creating meaningful connections with each other and with the divine forces that shaped their existence. The moon, now rising above the eastern hills like a silver cup filled with celestial wine, cast gentle light across the vineyard landscape and the drowsy figures of gods and mortals who had shared in this day of innovation and discovery. Its peaceful radiance seemed to bless what had been accomplished, while promising that similar opportunities for joy and community would continue to arise wherever people gathered with good intentions and willing hearts. In this quiet moment, as sleep began to claim both mortal and immortal participants in the world's first vineyard picnic, Dionysus felt the deep contentment that comes to those who have successfully translated vision into reality, while remaining open to whatever unexpected gifts the process might reveal. The day had taught him as much as he had taught others, had shown him new aspects of his own divine nature, while demonstrating the remarkable capacity of mortals to embrace innovation when it was offered in the spirit of genuine celebration. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new opportunities to explore the infinite possibilities contained within his domain of wine, celebration, and the transformation of ordinary moments into extraordinary memories. But tonight, surrounded by the gentle sounds of a vineyard settling into peaceful rest after a day of unprecedented festivity, Dionysus allowed himself to drift into the kind of satisfied slumber that comes to gods who have spent their time well. In service of joy, the stars continued their ancient dance across the sky above sleeping vines heavy with fruit that would soon become wine, carrying within its depths the memories of this perfect day when divinity and mortality had collaborated to create something entirely new under the sun. And in that wine, whenever and wherever it was eventually consumed, would remain traces of the laughter and friendship, the muddy chaos and spontaneous music, the spilled cups and shared wisdom that had transformed a simple vineyard into the birthplace of celebration as the world had never known it before. In the gentle darkness, with vine leaves rustling soft lullabies in the night breeze, the god of wine smiled in his sleep, dreaming of all the vineyard picnics yet to come, all the joy still waiting to be discovered wherever mortals gathered to honor the gifts of earth and season, friendship and wine, divine blessing and human community. The first vineyard picnic was ending, but its legacy would flow forward like wine from an inexhaustible amphora, enriching every cup and every celebration that followed with the memory of this perfect day when gods and mortals had learned together that the greatest joy comes not from perfection, but from the willingness to embrace whatever beautiful chaos emerges. When hearts are open and wine flows freely under the boundless sky, sleep well, gentle listener, carried on the same evening breeze that rustles through ancient vines heavy with the promise of wine, laughter, and celebrations yet to come.